They found the boy sitting cross-legged on the frozen bank of Buckhorn Creek, 12 years old, barefoot, holding a whittling knife and a half-carved wooden sparrow, the morning after the fever wagon carried his mother away, and the town of Ridgewood decided he was nobody's problem. That was the autumn of 1881, and the boy's name was Caleb Wren. The last thing his mother ever whispered to him, her lips cracked and burning, her eyes already looking past this world, was a sentence that made no sense at the time. She said, "Caleb, the cliff remembers. Your father left something in the cliff." She died with her hand on his cheek, and by nightfall the undertaker had wrapped her in canvas, and the town marshal, a thick-necked man named Yates, knocked on the cabin door and told the boy he had until sunrise to clear out. The cabin belonged to the mining company now, Yates explained. Had belonged to them since Caleb's father, Thomas Wren, died in the tunnel collapse 3 years prior. The company had let the widow stay on account of Christian charity, Yates said, but charity only stretched so far, and the boy was not the widow, and the cabin was needed for a foreman coming up from Denver. Caleb asked where he was supposed to go. Yates shrugged. "The Methodist home in Cheyenne takes orphans," he said. "Stage comes through Thursday. You can sleep in the livery barn until then." But Caleb did not sleep in the livery barn, and he did not wait for Thursday's stage, because he remembered something his father had shown him 2 summers before the collapse, a place nobody in Ridgewood knew about, a place carved not by hands but by 10,000 years of water cutting through sandstone, hidden behind a curtain of wild clematis on the eastern face of Table Bluff, 3 miles outside of town. "The cliff remembers," his mother had said. And Caleb, shivering in the October wind with nothing but a bedroll, a cast-iron skillet, his father's whittling knife, and a burlap sack of dried beans, decided to go find out what the cliff was keeping. He walked those 3 miles in the dark. The wind came straight off the high plains and cut through his wool coat like it was made of paper. He could smell snow in the air, that sharp metallic scent that any child of the territories learned to recognize before they learned to read. His feet were numb by the time he reached the base of Table Bluff, and for a terrible moment he could not find the clematis curtain. Everything looked different in the dark, the rock face a wall of black against a blacker sky. Then his hand found it, the vines, brittle, now with autumn, and behind them the gap in the stone, just wide enough for a grown man to turn sideways and slip through. Caleb squeezed inside and felt the temperature change immediately. The wind stopped. The air grew still and warmer, carrying a faint mineral smell like wet pennies. He struck a match from the tin in his coat pocket, and what he saw made his breath catch. The passage opened into a chamber roughly 20 feet across and 10 feet high, with walls so smooth they looked polished. The sandstone was layered in bands of rust and cream and pale gold, but it was not the beauty that stopped him. It was the warmth. In the back corner of the chamber, water seeped from a crack in the rock, trickling down the wall into a shallow basin carved naturally into the floor. The water was warm, not hot, but warm, the kind of warm that a boy who had been walking 3 miles in October wind would sell his soul for. And along the far wall, stacked neatly on a natural shelf of rock, were things that should not have been there. A tin box, a coil of rope, 3 candles, a folded square of oilcloth, a hand-drawn map on brown paper. His father had been here. His father had been preparing something. Caleb Wren sat down on the stone floor of that hidden chamber, felt the warmth of the earth radiating up through the rock, and he did not cry, because he had decided on the walkover that he was done crying. Instead, he lit one of the candles, opened the tin box, and found inside it a note in his father's careful handwriting. It read, "This mountain has a warm heart. Build from the inside out, trust the stone." Caleb did not fully understand those words that night, but over the days and weeks and months that followed, he came to understand them so completely that they became the architecture of his survival, and eventually the architecture of something far greater than survival. He began the next morning. The first problem was the entrance. Anyone passing along the creek trail could spot the clematis curtain if they looked carefully, and Caleb had learned from the way Ridgewood had treated his mother that people who found what you had would try to take it. So he gathered deadfall branches and loose sandstone slabs from the talus slope below the bluff, and built a false wall across the outer gap, leaving only a narrow passage at the bottom that he could crawl through on his belly. From 10 feet away, it looked like nothing but another section of collapsed rock face. The second problem was water. The warm sieve in the back of the chamber provided drinking water, but the flow was thin, barely enough to fill a cup in a minute. His father's map, which Caleb studied by candlelight until he had memorized every line, showed that the seep connected to a deeper source. The map marked it with a star, and the words Hot Spring, Maine, and an arrow pointing to a second chamber deeper in the rock. On his third day, Caleb found the connecting passage, a crawl space barely wide enough for his narrow shoulders, and it opened into a second chamber twice the size of the first, where the warm spring emerged in earnest from a fissure in the floor. The water pooled naturally in a basin the size of a horse trough, steaming gently, and the temperature in this inner chamber stayed constant. Caleb would later learn, through years of observation, that it never dropped below 55 degrees, even in the dead of January when the outside air plunged to 30 below. 55 degrees does not sound warm to modern ears. But for a boy sleeping on stone in the 1880s, 55 degrees without wind was the difference between life and death. He spent the first 2 weeks solving heat, shelter, and food, in that order, the way any pioneer survivor must. For heat, the spring itself was the foundation. He discovered that by channeling the warm water through shallow trenches he carved into the sandstone floor with his father's knife and a sharp rock, he could create a kind of radiant floor heating, the warm water running beneath his sleeping area before draining back into the natural basin. The Romans had done something similar 2,000 years earlier with their hypocaust systems, but Caleb did not know about Romans. He only knew that warm water under flat stones made a warm bed. For shelter, the cave itself did most of the work. The sandstone walls provided what builders call thermal mass. They absorbed the warmth from the spring during the constant flow and released it slowly and evenly. There were no drafts, no wind chill, no convective heat loss. Caleb improved on nature by packing the cracks and gaps with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and ash that he found worked better than anything else for sealing stone. This was an old technique, older than memory. The cliff-dwelling peoples of the Southwest had used the same mixture centuries before the first white settlers crossed the Mississippi, and Caleb's father, who had worked in mines throughout Colorado and New Mexico, had learned it from Pueblo workers and passed it to his son in the casual way fathers pass essential knowledge, not knowing which lessons will one day save a life. For food, Caleb relied on what his mother had taught him. She had been a practical woman, raised on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, and she had taught her son to identify wild plants the way other mothers taught their children hymns. In the first weeks, he gathered the last of the autumn's wild rose ships, which grew thick along the creek bank. He dried them on flat rocks near the warm spring where the gentle heat dehydrated them slowly without cooking away the nutrients. He caught rabbits with snares made from the rope in his father's tin box. He smoked the meat over a tiny fire built in the upper chamber, where a natural chimney crack in the ceiling drew the smoke upward and dispersed it so thoroughly that no one below could see or smell it. And he carved. Every night by candlelight and later by the glow of tallow lamps he rendered from rabbit fat, Caleb carved. He carved shelves into the walls. He carved a channel system for the water. He carved a sleeping alcove with a raised platform so the warm air would gather around him as he slept. He carved niches for storing food with fitted stone lids that kept out insects and mice. He carved a small window, no bigger than his hand, through 4 feet of rock to the outside, angled downward so that light entered, but rain and snow could not. That window took him 3 weeks. His hands bled. The knife dulled, and he re-sharpened it on the sandstone until the blade was half its original width. But when he finished, when a thin blade of morning sunlight fell through that tiny aperture and struck the far wall of his chamber and turned the stone to gold, Caleb Wren sat in his cliffside sanctuary and felt something he had not felt since his father was alive. He felt safe. Months passed. Autumn surrendered to winter, and winter in the Wyoming Territory was a merciless thing. Snow buried the creek valley under 3 feet of white silence. The temperature dropped so far that the sap in the pines froze, and the trees cracked open with sounds like gunshots in the night. Ridgewood huddled around its potbelly stoves and cursed the cold and assumed, when anyone thought of it at all, that the Wren boy had either made it to Cheyenne or died somewhere in the sage. A woman named Clara Dunhill thought of him more than most. She was 38 years old, a seamstress, a widow herself. Her husband had died of typhus in '79, and she had survived on mending and laundry and the kind of quiet, fierce economy that widows of the frontier practiced as naturally as breathing. Clara had brought soup to Caleb's mother in her last days, and she had argued with Marshal Yates about sending the boy away. And Yates had told her to mind her own mending. In December, Clara spotted something that nobody else noticed. She was gathering deadfall for kindling along the creek trail when she saw, in the fresh snow near the base of Table Bluff, footprints. Small footprints, a child's footprints leading to the rock face and vanishing. She followed them. She found the false wall. She found the crawl space. And when she squeezed through and stood up inside Caleb Wren's sanctuary and saw what a 12-year-old boy had built in 2 months of solitary labor, Clara Dunhill, who was not a woman given to emotion, put her hand over her mouth and wept. The chamber was immaculate. The carved shelves held rows of dried roships, smoked rabbit, and rendered fat. The water channels murmured softly, carrying warmth through the stone floor. The air was clean and still and warm, 57 degrees by Clara's reckoning, while outside it was 9 below zero. Caleb himself stood against the far wall, thin but not starving, alert but not afraid, holding his whittling knife like he was ready to defend every inch of what he had made. Clara said, "I am not here to take anything from you." Caleb said nothing. She said, "I knew your mother. I brought her soup. She told me you were clever, but she did not tell me you were this clever." And slowly, the way you gentle a half-wild horse, Clara Dunhill earned the trust of Caleb Wren. She brought him flour and salt and a woolen blanket. He showed her the second chamber, the hot spring, the carved water channels. She recognized the techniques, some of them, because her own grandmother had lived in a sod house on the Nebraska plains and had spoken of earthen insulation and root cellars kept warm by banked coals and buried stone. Clara did not tell anyone in Ridgewood about the boy in the cliff. She understood, as only a widow who had been told to mind her own mending could understand, that some knowledge is safer kept quiet. But she began to help. Through the winter of 1881 and into 1882, Clara visited the bluff twice a week. She brought supplies. More importantly, she brought knowledge. She taught Caleb how to make pemmican, the old way, pounding dried meat and berries and fat together into dense cakes that would keep for months without spoiling. She taught him to line his storage niches with cedar bark to repel insects. She showed him how to bank a fire so that a single handful of coals could hold warmth for 12 hours, and how to position a fire reflector of flat stone so that radiant heat bounced back into the living space instead of rising uselessly to the ceiling. In return, Caleb taught Clara about the rock. He had developed an instinct for the sandstone, could tap it with his knuckle, and know from the sound whether a section was solid or hollow, thick or dangerously thin. He showed her the natural ventilation system, how warm air rose through the chimney crack and drew fresh air in through the entrance passage, creating a constant, gentle circulation that kept the air breathable even with a fire burning. He had learned this by nearly suffocating once. In his first week, when he had sealed the entrance too tightly and built a fire that consumed the oxygen. He had crawled out gasping into the cold night and understood, in the way children of the frontier understood things, that the mountain was alive and breathing, and you had to breathe with it. By the spring of 1882, the sanctuary had grown. Caleb carved a third chamber, smaller, for storage. He built a smoking rack in the upper chamber and began preserving fish from the creek. Clara brought him seed potatoes, and he discovered that the warm, moist air of the spring chamber could sprout them, and he planted them in clay pots filled with creekside soil, mixed with bat guano from a nearby cave, which made them grow with extraordinary vigor. He was 13 now, taller, stronger. His hands were calloused and scarred from the stone. He spoke rarely, and when he did his voice had the careful precision of someone who had spent a long time listening to silence. Clara told him he sounded like an old man in a boy's body, and he almost smiled. 2 more years passed. The sanctuary expanded into something remarkable. 5 chambers now, connected by carved passages, each with its own purpose. A sleeping chamber with a radiant floor. A kitchen chamber with ventilation for cooking smoke. A spring chamber for bathing and warmth. A storage chamber lined with cedar. And a workshop where Caleb carved, endlessly, obsessively, turning raw sandstone into functional beauty. He had carved a chair, a table, shelves with fitted lids, even a small fireplace with a chimney that connected to the natural crack above, drawing perfectly, smoking never. He had also carved something else. Something he showed no one, not even Clara. Behind a fitted stone panel in the deepest part of the 5th chamber, Caleb had discovered what his father's map had been pointing toward all along. A 6th chamber, natural not carved, that opened into a space as large as Ridgewood's general store. And in this chamber, the hot spring surfaced in full force, a pool of clear water 8 feet across and warm enough to steam, surrounded by mineral deposits that glittered white and gold in candlelight. This was what his father had found. This was what Thomas Wren had been mapping before the mine collapse killed him. A geothermal spring of remarkable output, warm enough to heat a structure 10 times the size of Caleb's sanctuary. The old miner had understood what he had discovered. Build from the inside out, the note had said. Trust the stone. Caleb told no one about the 6th chamber. He was 16 now, and he had learned that in Ridgewood anything of value was taken from those too weak to hold it. He sealed the panel and kept his secret, and the warm heart of the mountain beat on in the dark. Then came April of 1885, and the tornado. They did not get many tornadoes in that part of Wyoming. The terrain was wrong for it, too high, too broken by bluffs and ridges. But weather does not read geography books, and on the 14th of April, a supercell thunderstorm built over the Laramie Range and dropped a funnel that touched down 6 miles southwest of Ridgewood and carved a path of destruction straight through the heart of the valley. Caleb heard it before he saw it. He was outside the bluff, checking his snare line along the creek, when the sky turned the color of a bruise, green, black, and swollen, and the air went dead still in that terrible way that means something enormous is about to move. He smelled ozone. He felt the pressure drop in his ears like plunging underwater. And then he heard it, a sound like a locomotive made of wind, a roaring so deep and vast that it seemed to come from inside the earth itself. He ran for the bluff, not out of fear for himself. The sanctuary was buried in stone. No wind on earth could touch it. He ran because from the top of the creek trail he could see Ridgewood in the valley below, and what he saw stopped him cold. The funnel was black and massive, wider at the base than the town's main street was long. It moved with a deliberate, almost lazy rotation, but its edges boiled with debris. Roof boards, fence posts, a wagon wheel spinning like a coin tossed by God. The sound was beyond description. It was not just loud, it was a physical force, a pressure against the chest and eyes, a vibration in the teeth and bones. The tornado hit Ridgewood at 4:17 in the afternoon. It took the general store first, peeling the roof off like the lid of a sardine tin and scattering the contents across a quarter-mile of prairie. It took the livery barn next, and the horses inside, and Caleb could hear them screaming even above the wind. It took the church steeple. It took the schoolhouse. It took 14 homes in the space of 90 seconds, reducing them to matchwood and scattering the matchwood across the sage. And then it was gone. The funnel lifted, dissolved into the green-black cloud, and the cloud moved northeast, and the light returned, and Ridgewood lay in ruins under a sky that was suddenly obscenely blue. Caleb stood on the creek trail and looked down at the town that had thrown him out 4 years ago, and felt something complicated move through his chest. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something heavier and sadder than either of those things. He went to find Clara first. Her house was on the eastern edge of town and had been spared the worst. But the roof was half gone, and the chimney had collapsed inward, filling the parlor with brick and soot. Clara was standing in her yard, covered in plaster dust, bleeding from a cut above her eye, but upright and steady. She looked at Caleb and said, "How bad?" Caleb said, "Bad. Half the town is gone." Clara said, "People?" Caleb said, "I do not know yet." They found out over the next hour. 2 dead. Old Martin Jessup, crushed by a falling beam in the general store where he had been buying tobacco. And an infant, the Collins baby, killed by flying glass. 17 more injured, some badly. Broken bones, lacerations, a punctured lung, burns from overturned stoves and scattered coals, and no shelter. The town of Ridgewood, which had prided itself on its sturdy frame buildings and its civilized amenities and its distance from the primitive conditions of the open frontier, had no shelter. The buildings that still stood were structurally unsound. The temperature was dropping as evening came on, and rain was falling now. Cold, hard rain that turned the debris fields into mud and soaked the wounded and the homeless, where they huddled under whatever scraps of roofing they could find. Marshall Yates, who had once told a 12-year-old boy to sleep in the livery barn and wait for the Cheyenne stage, stood in the wreckage of his own office and stared at the sky and had no idea what to do. It was Clara who said it. She said it quietly, to Caleb standing beside her in the rain. She said, "It is time." Caleb looked at her. He was 16, but looked older. His jaw was set. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had been building something in secret for 4 years, something born of abandonment and loneliness and the stubborn refusal to die. He said, "They will take it from me." Clara said, "They will not. I will make sure of it." "But Caleb, there are children out here in the rain. There is a man with a punctured lung who will die before morning without warmth and shelter. You can save them." Caleb Wren looked at the ruined town. He looked at the people who had looked away when his mother was dying. He looked at Marshall Yates, who was bleeding from both hands and shaking with cold. And he made a decision that had nothing to do with forgiveness, not yet, and everything to do with the kind of person his mother and father had raised him to be. He said, "Follow me." He led them through the rain. 23 people, including 6 children, 4 of them under the age of 5. He led them up the creek trail and along the base of Table Bluff, and they stared at the false wall and did not understand until Caleb pulled away the stones and revealed the crawl space and said, "One at a time." The children first. They crawled through, and one by one, they stood up inside Caleb Wren's sanctuary, and they stopped speaking. The warmth hit them first. After hours in the cold rain, the steady 57-degree air of the stone chamber felt like an embrace. The mineral smell of the spring, the soft sound of water moving through carved channels, the candlelight catching the layered bands of sandstone, rust and cream and gold, the shelves stocked with smoked meat and dried roe ships and pemmican and potatoes, the carved furniture, the stone table, the chair, the sleeping alcove with its radiant heated floor. A woman named Agnes Pryor, who had once said at the general store, loud enough for Clara to hear, that the Wren boy was probably dead in a ditch somewhere, and good riddance because his father had been a drunk and his mother no better, stood in the middle of Caleb's carved sanctuary and could not speak. Her 3-year-old daughter clung to her leg, shivering, and Caleb knelt down and wrapped the child in a rabbit fur blanket he had stitched himself and carried her to the warm floor near the spring channel and set her down gently. Agnes Pryor started to cry. Caleb showed them the second chamber, the hot spring where they could warm themselves. He showed them the storage chamber with its food supply, enough to feed 23 people for a week if they were careful. He showed them the ventilation system, how the mountain breathed, how the air stayed fresh. He showed them everything except the 6th chamber. That secret he kept still, behind its fitted stone panel, in the deepest dark. They stayed 3 days. The rain stopped. The sun came out. Ridgewood began to rebuild. But in those 3 days, something shifted in the town that no amount of frame lumber and iron nails could have constructed. On the second night, Marshall Yates, whose hands were wrapped in bandages torn from Caleb's own spare shirt, sat by the warm spring and said to the boy, "I told you to sleep in the livery barn." Caleb said nothing. Yates said, "The livery barn is gone now, along with most everything else I thought was solid." He paused. Then he said, "I was wrong, son. I was wrong about a great many things, but I was especially wrong about you." Caleb looked at the marshal for a long time. Then he said, "My mother taught me that a person's worth is not decided by other people's opinions. It is decided by what they build when nobody is watching." Clara Dunhill, sitting in the corner with a sleeping child in her lap, smiled in the candlelight. When the town emerged from the cliff 3 days later, blinking in the sunlight, they were different people. Not better, not yet, but cracked open in the way that allows better to eventually grow. The town council voted unanimously to grant Caleb Wren legal title to the homestead claim on Table Bluff and the mineral rights beneath it. Clara Dunhill stood at the meeting and explained, in her quiet, precise way, that the boy had been surviving alone in that cliff for 4 years and had built something that none of them, with all their frame houses and iron stoves, had managed to build. A place that could not be blown away. In the months that followed, Caleb did something no one expected. He opened the 6th chamber. He showed Clara first, and then the town engineer, a man named Aldrich Bosch, who had come from Denver to assess the tornado damage. Bosch took one look at the geothermal spring and the massive natural chamber and said, in a voice tight with amazement, "Do you have any idea what this is worth?" Caleb said, "It is not for sale." Instead, he proposed something else. With Bosch's help and Clara's tireless organizing, they channeled the hot spring water through a system of carved stone pipes, expanding on Caleb's original design to heat a community shelter built into the lower chambers of the bluff. The shelter could hold 60 people. The water kept it warm to the worst of winter. Root cellars carved into the constant temperature rock preserved food for months without salt or smoke. A ventilation system based on Caleb's original design kept the air clean. They called it Wren's Rest. It became the town's refuge, its insurance against the next storm, the next blizzard, the next disaster that the vast and indifferent Wyoming sky decided to send. And over the years, as Ridgewood grew and prospered, the cliff dwelling became something more than shelter. It became a symbol, a reminder that the most enduring things are not built from the outside, from lumber and nails and the approval of neighbors, but from the inside out, from stone, from knowledge, from the quiet, stubborn love of a boy who had been left behind and chose to build instead of break. Clara Dunhill lived to be 72. She never remarried. She never needed to. She became the town's historian, its keeper of stories, and the story she told most often, to children and grandchildren and strangers passing through, was the story of the boy in the cliff. She always ended it the same way. She would say they left him with nothing. A knife, a bedroll, a sack of beans, and he carved a home out of the living rock with his own 2 hands. Not because he was angry, not because he wanted to prove them wrong, but because his mother told him the cliff remembers and he was the kind of boy who listened. Then she would lean forward, the way she did, and say, "The world will try to throw you out into the cold. It will tell you there is no room for you. But the earth is old and patient and warm, and if you are willing to listen, it will show you where to build. You just have to be brave enough to crawl through the dark to find it." Caleb Wren lived in Ridgewood for the rest of his life. He married. He had children. He became, in the quiet way of men who have survived solitude, a beloved figure in the town. But every evening, no matter the season, he walked the 3 miles to Table Bluff, crawled through the passage, and sat for a while in the 1st chamber, the one he had found at 12 years old, shivering and alone in the October dark. He would run his hand along the smooth, carved walls. He would listen to the water murmuring through its channels. He would feel the warmth of the stone beneath him, the slow, steady heartbeat of the mountain that had sheltered him when no one else would. And sometimes, in the candlelight, he would take out his whittling knife, the one his father had given him, worn now to a sliver, and he would carve. Not shelves, not channels, it's not anything useful, just a small wooden sparrow, like the one he had been holding the morning they told him to leave. He carved sparrows by the dozen over the years, and he left them on windowsills and fence posts and doorsteps throughout Ridgewood, and no one ever knew where they came from, these small, perfect birds appearing like gifts from the stone itself. But the children knew. Children always know. And on cold nights, when the wind howled down from the high plains and the town huddled around its stoves, The children of Ridgewood would press their faces to the windows and look toward the dark shape of Table Bluff against the stars, and they would whisper to each other that the cliff was still warm inside, still breathing, still remembering, and it was.